issue is called spiritual activism, faith, freedom, and liberation. And what we're wanting to explore is, well, we all know what activism is. Of course, activism is the efforts people make on behalf of causes, on behalf of things that they feel should be promoted and or things that should be stopped. So then what we want to explore is, what could we mean by spiritual activism? Is spiritual activism done by people who have spiritual interests? Is spiritual activism in regards to spirituality or spiritual institutions? And I believe that what we will find is that spiritual activism is activism that is motivated by deep spiritual drives, that is shaped and guided by those same drives and fueled by those drives, that there's something inherently and deeply spiritual that is driving an individual to work for change in some form or another. And so when we were doing this issue, I thought of you and the work that I know that you're involved with. And maybe we could start by you speaking a little bit about the type of activism that you are engaged with and have been engaged with.
So I would agree with your definition in terms of it's something that emerges from within. It's not imposed from outside. It's not in relationship to institutions. It's something emergent. And I feel as though it's a response to wanting things to kind of express more truth, express more alignment, more harmony with inner and outer, and a desire for greater clarity and greater consciousness, I think, within and between. So I think that's kind of where I would go with that. And I think for me, it's really been in relationship to how can we bring that spiritual essence of knowing that you're not separate from the universe, from each other, to how we relate to our planet and our environment and nature. Because I think a lot of people feel that we're damaging our home, considerably, and it's not stopping, and people are continuing. And why is that continuing? And I think because there is a spiritual crisis at the heart of that people do not relate to themselves being one and the same with nature. So the calling seems to me to be awakening to the fact that we're not separate from the natural world. And I do feel that's what's driving me. Like it's something that we as a species need to become more conscious of quickly, because we're not the only ones here. We're part of a whole global ecosystem. We're part of the universe. We're part of life emerging. And we're not cognizant of that enough. We still act as if, we can act in isolation and the repercussions of our actions don't matter. Well, they do if everything is interconnected. And the only way we really will feel that is if we don't feel separate from our surroundings, our environment, the people that we affect. So to me, it comes back to that spiritual sense of oneness with everything, unity. And that doesn't mean everything's nice. It just means that there is no separation. So everything one does affects everything else. And so I think that's also very empowering, because it means that an individual also has the potential to affect change by their own evolution, their own spiritual awakening, because it will impact their decisions, their choices, and their impact in the world. So I find that's kind of hopeful in that way, that there's it does empower the individual, and in terms of activism, then you can actually you feel the fuel to keep giving to that, because it informs you.
So this is great, and it's great because you've actually expanded on the definition of spiritual activism that I started off with, because you said specifically, I don't even know if you expanded on the definition or you changed the definition, or you made a different possibility for a definition, which is, and you're speaking about the environmental crisis that our planet is facing. And what you said was the environmental crisis actually stems from a spiritual crisis, which is that we don't feel connected to the world, that we live in a bubble of isolation and separation. And that is inherently a spiritual crisis first. That spiritual crisis is manifesting as an environmental crisis or an ecological crisis. And so therefore, the way that you're talking about it, it would seem to imply that unless you affect change at the spiritual level, you won't be able to affect change at that external, physical, global level. Can you?
Well, it won't go far enough. It won't go far enough, right? Because I think people are responding to the environmental crisis, but I think there's a missing dimension to it. And this is the missing dimension, that, you know, technology solutions are out there, policy is out there. You know, people are doing a lot of things on a ground level. But if we don't have this dimension in it, then even the technological solutions and the policy decisions that people are going to make are still going to be in the framework of being separate from the natural world, from nature, from ourselves. So it will never quite meet it, because we're still going to be coming from the same place, even though we may be addressing those issues to some degree.
Great. So I want to stay with this for a little bit, because I think this is very interesting. And I think it's very much at the heart of what I know about the work that you do. So why is it, or can you explain a little bit why it is that as long as we don't shift that spiritually isolated sense of being, that we can't go far enough to solve our global problem? Because you said earlier, people are doing things, and yet in very substantial ways, there doesn't seem to be change. It's certainly not enough to meet the crisis. So why is it that we can't meet the crisis, even with our best intentions, if that spiritual division isn't solved?
Why can't we meet it? Because the paradigm we're going to be operating in is still going to be one based on separation. I think also, and you're much more well versed in this, Jeff, but in terms of the Enlightenment era, in terms of, you know, capitalism, in terms of all of the meta kind of context that we exist in, there are too many other drivers forcing us or making us consumers. I think that the framework is so much geared towards satisfying individual needs based on being separate, that whatever framework we come up with, whatever decisions we make, will still be based in that paradigm. It's a complete paradigm shift, right? To relate to oneself as not being separate, and that's a spiritual awakening. So I think we will create new problems. And maybe we will always create new problems, but will we be able to come to them and solve them from a place of no separation?
I find this very compelling, and I want to ask you I want to see if you can share with us maybe a concrete example of a problem where some amount of has occurred, but where this fundamental, and maybe explain to us why this fundamental division is impeding it from going all the way.
I don't know if I have any concrete examples specifically, but I can think of, you have the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of them. And the idea is that we're supposed to meet these by 2030, like eradicate poverty and, you know, global hunger and, you know, address climate change. There are so many goals there. And, you know, there are a lot of policy instruments in place, but there's this huge gap, and it's recognized that there's a huge gap. And it's inertia. I think it's just the inertia of the system, the political system, the economic system, and what we're grounded in. But I'm just kind of thinking, what's happening is some recognition of that. This isn't directly addressing your question, but what's happening is there's a recognition of that gap at this international level too. And as a result of the Sustainable Development Goals, you know, being clearly not met, And there's, between now, what we're 2024 and 2030, we're far from meeting those goals. People are becoming aware of the fact that the practical mechanisms that we have in place will not help us get there. And part of that recognition is pointing back to inner development capacities that individuals have who are decision makers and policy makers and people in, positions of power in the sense of being able to leverage their, whatever institution they may be at to affect change. Have they got the inner capacities themselves to be able to make decisions which are based in a deeper kind of context, which isn't based on separation? So I think that's being recognized. And there are these development tools that are being produced in relationship to mindfulness training, empathy, relatability in terms of, can you see the connection between you and another person and more than human world. So that's being recognized as a gap, and I think people are trying to meet that gap now. What inner transformation do we need to put in place to be able to meet our outer transformational needs?
Yeah, no, that's already powerful because it's acknowledging that in order to affect external change, there needs to also be an internal transformation, which is, I think, fundamentally what you're saying. And maybe part of that, and I'd like to hear you respond to this, but maybe part of that is because, as you said at the beginning, we feel separate from the earth. So maybe the ecological challenges, maybe that allows us not to feel enough. If you feel separate from something,
you're not going to care about it in the same way.
You don't care about it as much, right? If it's your own body, you care about it a lot. If it's somebody else's body, especially if it's a body far away, it's hard to care in the same way. So there is a kind of expansion of inclusion to include the whole world in our sphere of concern.
Yeah, and I think it's attributing sentience and selfhood to entities outside of yourself on your normal frame of reference. Like, I'm just thinking of human rights for animals, right? People treat animals as if they have no interiority, whereas that's changing. And that's also changing with land formations. You have rivers that are being given rights, and this is a very different way of relating. You only get there if you feel that there's a sense of connection and no separation there. Otherwise, it's just a resource. Land is just a resource in our common terminology. And even ecosystem services still, to me, feels very removed. It's like it's a service that's being delivered to humans for their benefit, but it's still externalizing and removing. Whereas if you kind of see a river as an entity unto itself, which has sentience, and a lot of this comes from like indigenous peoples, not land-based people's knowledge, where spirituality is very tied up with the land. Their sense of spirituality is directly connected to the land, and we don't necessarily have that in the West. That's not the way we relate to the natural world. And I think again, part of that is to do with the Age of Enlightenment and creation stories that are different, where we can use and dominate the natural world for our benefit, which is very different to an indigenous person's perspective, where you're there to serve.
So this is another interesting channel, because you mentioned something that I think is really important. And it has to do with a fundamental distinction between a thing and a being. A thing is just a thing. It doesn't demand our concern. If you have a shovel, it's a thing. You can keep jamming it into the earth really hard and you never feel bad. You don't feel like, oh, I'm hurting the poor shovel, right? It's a being, right? If you had a being, if you had even an animal and you jammed it into the earth in the same way, you'd feel bad. That's a living being. It has feelings. You're saying it's sentient, feels something. It's got some kind of awareness of being alive to it. And the question is, where is that line? So there's a book, Humankind, by Timothy Morton. It's really about this line. It's about how far does does the line of being a being extend? Is there a line? You know,
I don't think there's a line.
I think ultimately, people like Timothy Morton and others are saying, well, there is actually no thing, because we live in a the universe itself is alive, and therefore everything in it is alive. Right. So, and that is a spiritual realization.
I relate to that, because if the foundation of reality is consciousness, and we relate to that as an awake mind, and our essence is being, which emerges from that, and everything emerges from that, where is the separation? I don't see where a separation could be if everything emerges from that. And of course, it depends. If you feel as like consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain, that's a whole materialistic relationship to consciousness. Whereas if you relate to consciousness as primary and that everything emerges out of that, then there is no line. Everything comes from there. It's just density of energy and matter, right?
Yes. So I'm backtracking a little, but can you tell us a little bit about some of the work that you've been engaged with in the domain of the environment?
Basically, I have been working for a Center for Integrative Health for a number of years. And what I really enjoyed about that was the focus on mind-body medicine. So there's an acknowledgement of the relationship between the mind and the body in relationship to well-being. And I, as you know, have had 20 years within our spiritual community practicing meditation. And although that wouldn't be considered mindfulness in the same way, there is that appreciation for interiority. So this has been really interesting for me to kind of transition from that to incorporating what my academic background was and passion for environmental sustainability, protecting the environment. When I was really young, I joined Greenpeace as a supporter, and I don't know where that urge came from. And I would put it back to what we started this conversation with, of a spiritual connection to the land and to our natural environment as not being separate, as being part of me somehow. Why would I care about it when nobody else around me cared about it? It just emerged. And that's been a trajectory, throughout. And so as I find myself professionally in this place where I can bring together my interest and background in environmental sustainability and this work in the interiority, the two are merging. And I work at a place where this kind of the fuzzy lines can be crossed here. So we're exploring that more. Like, what is the relationship between spirituality and health and well-being, and the relationship to planetary health and well-being? It's bidirectional. Some of the work I've been involved with is what I've written a couple of papers now, looking at the healthcare system with some of my colleagues in relationship to that's primarily disease management. The way that the American healthcare system is really set up, it's about treating disease. Whereas can we reverse that and actually generate health? And one of the ways that we can support that is preventive medicine. So this is the work that I've been involved with from the healthcare side. And when you look at preventive medicine, you're also looking at lifestyle changes. And then you can see that by adopting healthier lifestyles, you can simultaneously reduce your carbon footprint on the planet as well. If you stop driving a car and instead go on a bicycle, you're going to improve your own health and well-being, and you're also going to pollute less. So there's the relationship there. So really encouraging those kind of behaviors and working with different organizations and scholars, I guess, who are supporting those kind of lifestyle changes. And then I think it's also the thing that I'm most interested in is what we've been speaking about, of trying to help create a space where this perspective really takes root much more, of reframing our relationship to the planet and definition of health and well-being. And does it stop at our skin? Does it stop at our human communities? Can we have healthy people without a healthy planet? And do we get to a healthy planet just by material means, or is there a different framing that we need to really adopt internally, at a root of both morals, ethics, values and spiritual orientation. Is that something that we need to be really exploring? And I think my answer would be yes, to facilitate, health both on the inside and the outside, and one which is bi-directional with the planet. So I'm working with other organizations that share this outlook and this space. And I think the main work really is trying to propagate that kind of space for more people to engage in it, to discuss in that framing. And people who are in positions where they can affect change, the more that lens is adopted, and the more the practical decisions and policies that are put in place will be informed by that view.
Fantastic. So I want to do a follow-on question from something you said, which is, you said in the domain of health, the health systems in place are really about disease management rather than health management, right? Would you say that there is a correlation in environmentalism where similarly environmentalism is about disease management rather than health management?
I think there has been an orientation. I mean, conservation, you could say, I'm sure it has two sides to it, right? Conservation primarily was to conserve a space and to not have anything bad happen to it. But that's still coming from a place of fear fundamentally, right? Of wanting bad things to not happen. And you're conserving this, you're putting a ring around a certain area of land so that what happens on that land is protected. And the interesting thing is, again, going back to Indigenous people's perspectives, is land doesn't stay healthy on its own. Humans interact with it. And there's a co-partnership that actually allows ecosystems to flourish. So it's not just by leaving things alone that things are kept healthy. And often that's from a anti-human perspective. It's like, if only humans weren't here, everything would be fine. In a certain way, that could be correlated with disease management. We could be seen as the disease, the virus that's kind of ruining everything. But no, actually, I don't think that's the case. We've emerged as part and parcel of this whole phenomena. So we're integral to that. We're not a virus here. We are part of what can be a healthy ecosystem too, if we're not out of alignment with everything. I think that's what's happened. We're out of alignment in terms of our own role as a species. And that comes back again to, how do we perceive ourselves? Do we perceive ourselves as separate? Do we perceive ourselves as superior to, the rest of the ecosystem and the planet? Or do we see ourselves as relational and a keystone species, as something I've kind of come across says recently? We do have a role here, an important role, but it's not at the expense of other ecosystem partners.
That's beautifully said. And it really does get back to the original point, which is there's a shift in how we need to see ourselves and relate to the world that's essential. And you just gave that example where if we're thinking of human beings as somehow the disease, and therefore the solution is to extract human activity from the planet, that may not be the solution. That we need to be part of the solution. We need to not just not be a problem. We need to actually be a solution. Right?
Well, and also like a lot of the wildfires, I mean, I'm not an expert in this area, but wildfire management has been suppression of fires, whereas actually having controlled fires is a lot better way to prevent wildfires from happening. So by just stopping fires, we've ended up with this plethora of fires, right, over the last several years, out of control. And so that's not good forest management. I mean, again, I'm not an expert in this area, but that's to do with the relationship to the land. Like if you just stop activity, everything's going to be fine, it will take care of itself. No, there's an actual active participation with the environment where humans play a role and they manage. And that has a beneficial effect.
Well, I'm feeling the power of this view, which is because I think we all probably to some extent have a little bit of that sense that somehow human beings are the problem. We're driving too many cars and we're doing this and we're doing that. And if we just stop doing all that, everything would be right. And this is a different orientation, which is it's not just about stopping doing those things. It may be about, that may be true, but it's also about discovering what is our natural relationship to the environment. Like, what is the role human beings are supposed to play in the environment? So I'm finding that view coming from you very inspiring.
Yeah, because it may, as you said, it may result in the same thing in terms of people reducing car usage and flying and everything, consumerism, but it will be driven by a change in values, from your core. It won't be because you're forced not to drive your car anymore because it's bad for the environment. So that kind of suppression isn't going to work because you're not changing your own outlook, or you're not encouraging others to have a different outlook. That's more about control than I think.
Interesting. I'm seeing the depth of change, the inner change that needs to accompany the outer work. So in this age that we're in, where obviously there's a lot of information about how bleak our kind of environmental outlook is, and I think it's true. I mean, I think a lot of this information is true, but in the midst of all that, what gives you hope? What inspires you that something different is possible?
I think there are a lot of people and movements and pockets of exploration that are looking at this and are trying to bring it into being. So I think one thing is knowing you're not alone. People are not alone in this. I think there is an emergence that's happening in different ways. You keep bumping into different people like, oh, people weren't saying that just a couple of years ago. I went to a conference, I think 1 or 2 years ago, and people were saying, we are nature. People wouldn't say that a few years ago. And that statement, just to kind of bring in, we are nature. We don't have to protect nature or save the environment. We are the environment. We are nature. So that closing of that, identity, it's happening in different spheres, people that are involved in this. So seeing that emerge is what gives me hope. And I think continuing to kind of feed into that and allow these conversations to help inform our own kind of internal changes. That's what gives me hope. I think it's real. I think that's really important. It's not a figment of one's imagination. I think that there's evolution happening at deep levels, I think, of self. And that may not sit well in certain academic spheres and in mainstream kind of society, but I think a lot of people are yearning for it. So even that yearning is an expression of that trying to emerge in and of itself. And the more that people find others who have that yearning and are willing to even just talk about it, brings it into being. So, I come across different podcasts and different conferences and different papers where that view is continuing to emerge and continuing to become more mainstream, and the language is becoming more and more accessible as well for people. I think that's what gives me hope. I see it emerging basically, and I want to continue to keep contributing to it too.